In 1876, a young Philadelphia schoolteacher agreed, reluctantly, to sit for an artist she barely knew, on one strict condition: that no one could ever know it was her. She was terrified that being an artist's model would cost her the teaching job she loved. She sat for 5 sessions and then went back to her quiet life, hoping the whole thing would be forgotten. Instead, her profile became one of the most reproduced human faces in the history of the world. Struck onto hundreds of millions of silver coins, carried in the pockets of gamblers and ranchers and outlaws across the American West. She spent the rest of her life running from that fame. This is the story of the Morgan dollar, and of the reluctant goddess whose face it wears. But to understand why the coin exists at all, you have to go back to a law that a whole generation of Americans came to call a crime. In 1873, Congress quietly passed a coinage act that placed the country firmly on the gold standard and ended the free coining of silver. At the time, almost nobody noticed. But the timing was catastrophic, because out in Nevada, miners had struck the Comstock Lode, one of the richest veins of silver ever found on Earth, and the mountains were pouring out silver by the ton. Just as the West filled with silver, the federal government had slammed its doors shut on buying it. When prices collapsed, the mining interests were enraged, and they gave the 1873 law a bitter nickname that stuck for decades: the Crime of 73. They wanted their silver back in American money, and they had the political muscle to fight for it. That fight produced a compromise called the Bland-Allison Act of 1878. It forced the Treasury to buy millions of dollars of silver every single month and strike it into a brand new silver dollar. President Rutherford Hayes hated the bill and vetoed it. Congress overrode him the same day. Like it or not, the silver dollar was coming back, and it needed a face. The man chosen to design it was an outsider, and that was no accident. His name was George T. Morgan, and he was English. A gifted young engraver trained at the Royal Mint in London, brought across the Atlantic because the Mint's director had grown quietly disgusted with the work of his own veteran engravers, the Barber family. When a design competition was announced between Morgan and the Mint's own chief engraver, the outcome was arguably rigged from the start. The director had hired Morgan specifically to hand him this kind of work. Morgan won, and it earned him the lasting resentment of the Mint's old guard. An Englishman parachuted in to reshape American money over the objections of the men who thought the job was theirs. Morgan wanted something no American coin had truly done before. Rather than sculpt an imaginary Greek goddess for his liberty, he wanted the face of a real living American woman. He tried several candidates and rejected them all. And then his friend, the great American painter Thomas Eakins, made a suggestion. Eakins knew a young woman named Anna Willis Williams, the daughter of a Philadelphia family who had posed for some of his own paintings. Morgan met her, and he was stunned. He declared her profile the most perfect he had ever seen in England or America. There was just one problem. Anna Williams did not want to be a goddess. In that era, being an artist's model carried a whiff of disrepute, and Williams was a serious young woman who intended to teach. She flatly refused at first. Only after her friends urged her on did she agree to sit, and only on the ironclad condition that her name never be revealed. For a couple of years the secret held, but in 1880 a journalist uncovered the truth and published it. The face on America's silver dollar belonged to a Philadelphia schoolteacher named Anna Williams, and her quiet life detonated. She was flooded with thousands of letters. Admirers showed up at her home and at her school. She was offered a career on the stage, offered romance, offered celebrity, and she turned all of it down. She called her modeling only an incident of my youth and refused to discuss it. She kept teaching until she retired, never married, and lived out her days shunning the fame that her own face had earned her by the 100 million. She is one of history's most seen and most reluctant faces. The coin itself made a rocky debut. When the first ones were struck in March of 1878, someone noticed the eagle on the reverse had 8 tail feathers, but American eagles by tradition always wore an odd number. The dies were hastily corrected to 7, creating a famous variety on the very first coins. and critics were not always kind to Morgan's eagle. Some thought it looked scrawny and unhealthy, and mockingly nicknamed the coin the buzzard dollar. Morgan, for his part, did something bold. He signed his work, tucking his initial M onto both the front and the back, an Englishman's small, permanent claim on the silver of the American frontier. Then the coin went to work, and it became the money of the mythic West. Morgan dollars poured out of 5 different mints, each leaving its own tiny mark. Philadelphia struck them bare. San Francisco added an S, New Orleans an O, and much later Denver a D. But the most romantic of all came from a tiny mint in the Nevada desert, stamped CC, Carson City, sitting practically on top of the Comstock silver that had started the whole fight. Those Carson City dollars, frontier coins from a mint that closed forever in 1893, would one day become the most coveted of all. But here's the strange truth about the Morgan dollar. For decades, hardly anybody actually wanted them. They were heavy, they were awkward, and most Americans preferred paper money. So millions upon millions of brand new silver dollars were struck, counted, sealed into canvas bags, and simply stored in treasury vaults, never circulating at all. And that quirk of history set up 2 of the greatest treasure stories in American coin collecting. The first is about the rarest Morgan of all. In 1895, the Philadelphia Mint's records show a small run of silver dollars struck for circulation, but virtually none of them can be found today. It's believed nearly all were tossed back into the melting pot in later years, never released. The 1895 Morgan became the king of the series, the one date collector can almost never complete a set without. So rare that a single fine example can bring hundreds of thousands of dollars. A coin that officially existed and then almost entirely vanished. The second story is pure buried treasure. Remember all those bags of silver dollars sealed in government vaults? For decades they sat forgotten. Then in the 1960s, as a nationwide run on silver emptied the Treasury's stockpile, clerks made an astonishing discovery. Sealed bags of pristine, uncirculated silver dollars that had been sitting untouched since the 1800s. And a huge share of them were rare Carson City coins. The government suddenly realized it was holding a fortune in collector coins in its own basement. It held back nearly 3 million of them and sold them off to the public through a series of famous mail bid auctions in the 1970s. Coins that had spent a century in the dark, marketed as the silver dollars that Jesse James and the outlaws of the West never managed to steal. And then there was the eccentric. In 1976, after the death of a reclusive Nevada millionaire named LaVere Redfield, a man famous for distrusting banks and burying his wealth, investigators tore open his home and found hidden in the basement over 400,000 silver dollars. Bag after bag of Morgans, squirreled away by a paranoid recluse. The hoard sold at auction for over $7 million and sent a fresh wave of Morgan fever through the collecting world. It was as if the coins themselves kept generating legends. The Morgan dollar's original run ended in 1904, when the silver required by law finally ran dry. It returned for a single encore year in 1921, and then gave way to its successor, the peace dollar, struck to honor the end of the First World War. Nearly 657 million Morgans had been made across its life, but so many were melted, hoarded, lost, and buried that the survivors became among the most passionately collected coins on the planet. A full century later, still the coin that introduces more people to the hobby than almost any other. So think about everything wrapped inside that heavy silver disc. A crime committed by Congress and the silver barons who fought it. An English engraver resented by his own colleagues. A reluctant schoolteacher who spent her life fleeing her own famous face. Frontier coins from a Wild West mint, a king that nearly vanished into the furnace, a fortune forgotten in government vaults, and a recluse's treasure buried in a basement. That is the Morgan dollar. Not just silver and copper, but the whole restless, silver-hungry story of the American West, pressed into a coin you can still hold in your hand.